Good afternoon, everyone. In commemoration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day 2025, Henkel Black Alliance presents The Fierce Urgency of Now, the business case for DEI, with keynote speaker Dr. Shakir Abdullah. My name is Angeline Lewis, and I am a senior scientist in HCB R&D in North America, and I serve as the president of the Stanford chapter of Henkel Black Alliance. The mission of HBA, Henkel Black Alliance, is developing Henkel's Black community and their allies to enrich the culture of our company by implementing employee-driven programs that educate and empower all employees to grow, and thus promoting diversity, equity, and inclusivity within Henkel and the community in a positive way. HBA currently has a chapter in Culver City, Madison Heights, Michigan, and here in Stamford, Connecticut. We, as an employee resource group here at Henkel, believe that a business case for DEI is a relevant conversation to have this afternoon. The climate for DEI is evolving, and recently there has been a magnification on DEI programs across the nation. Our featured presentation was inspired by the following excerpt from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous I Have a Dream speech. We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. This is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action. This afternoon, following the introduction of our keynote speaker, we will discuss the legacy of Dr. King, the business case for DEI, followed by a Q&A session for our in-person and online attendees. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Shakir Abdullah, founder of Principal Consultant for Practical Diversity Associates. He has 20+ years of experience in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Dr. Abdullah received his PhD from Auburn University with a focus on multicultural competence. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Shakir Abdullah.
Good afternoon. Excellent. Thank you all so much. Angeline, thank you for that warm welcome and introduction. Really excited to join you all this afternoon here at Henkel. This is my first visit to Connecticut, and I'm really excited about the folks who are here in person, as well as the folks who are online and joining us and learning about our conversation and participating in our conversation today. It is important that we dive into why there is such a fierce urgency of now. We're going to talk about the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we're going to talk about why this topic is important for this day and for this time. As we begin, I want to share a little bit of background on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on what would have been his 96th birthday. It's really important, I think, that we lean into a little bit of history of Dr. King so we can understand his legacy and why it's connected to the business case for DEI. I've worked for more than 20 years in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I like to call myself the DEI optimist, right? And why am I an optimist when it comes to DEI? It's because I believe in what Dr. King said as it relates to justice. King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. This arc doesn't just bend by itself. It really takes people of good faith and people who believe that everyone was created equal, and folks who believe that everyone has the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, whatever that may be. folks who are part of employee resource groups or ERGs like Hinkle Black Alliance, those are the kind of folks who help bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice. ERGs work with companies like Hinkle to support employees and to really help advance their products and their services and to create communities of practice that bring in cultural perspectives. And they host programs such as these that help remind people why it's so important to keep this work related to diversity, equity, and inclusion going. There's no time like the present, and it is imperative that we embrace this work and that we continue to move faster than just with all deliberate speed. And so today, I'm going to share the business case for diversity and inclusion, and I want to remind you all that we are better as a United States and as a united world when we work towards economic justice and embrace capitalistic principles that do not place barriers on people because of their identities or their perceived identities or the imagined threats of competition. And so as we lean into learning about Dr. King, I'd like to highlight that he was born Michael King on January 15th, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, to Michael and Alberta King. Today would have been his 96th birthday, as I said earlier. Dr. King's father was the senior pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and he participated in the Baptist World Alliance's meeting in Berlin, Germany, and it was during that trip he decided to change his name to Martin Luther King, after the father of the Reformation Christian movement. During King's visit, he went to the church where Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg Castle Church's door to challenge the Catholic Church. This trip profoundly impacted the senior King. And it really was so moving to him that it led him to change his own name and his son's name to Martin Luther instead of Michael King. And so Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was academically advanced for his age, and he skipped the 9th grade, and he actually went to college at Morehouse College in 1948. Morehouse College is the only historically black male college, all-male college, and King became an ordained minister during his time at Morehouse. He then received his divinity degree from Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, and his doctoral degree in theology from Boston University. And while in Boston, Dr. King became a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. That's the first black fraternity founded on a college campus for collegiate men. This is one of the many connections that I have with Dr. King. I also joined Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity 46 years after Dr. King did. While in Boston, Dr. King met Coretta Scott, a music student from Marion, Alabama, and in 1953, they were married, and that union produced their 4 children, Yolanda, Martin III, Dexter, and Bernice. The year after their wedding, they located to Montgomery, Alabama, and that's where Dr. King became the pastor at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church at the young age of 25. And I point out his age because sometimes we think our age is a barrier for us to be engaged. When he was in this role, he was selected to lead the Montgomery bus boycott. And he was selected to lead because he was so young and he probably didn't even know better what kind of issues he was getting into leading that boycott. That boycott propelled him to become the face of the civil rights movement. And he continued to work and continued to engage in agitation to change the way things were happening for black folks in the South and all over the country. On March 7th, 1957, known as Bloody Sunday, approximately 600 nonviolent protesters left Brown AME Chapel in Selma and marched 54 miles to Montgomery for voters' rights. As they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, law enforcement officers and local white residents attacked them with nightsticks and tear gas, and they hospitalized at least 50 protesters. This attack was televised, and because it was televised, it really allowed Americans and folks around the world to get a firsthand witness, a firsthand view of what was happening in the South, and it really led to more support for the civil rights movement. Dr. King led protests in other cities and places like Chicago, and ultimately, Dr. King led the March on Washington on August 28, 1963. 250,000 people marched from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial to draw attention to the challenges and inequalities that African Americans were facing in America. That same day, King recited his I Have a Dream speech. And, as we celebrate the 62nd anniversary of that speech, I think it's critical that we start at the beginning of that speech to better understand the context in which Dr. King was speaking on that day. I think the end of the speech is very inspirational and feel good, and most folks focus on that, but it's the beginning of the speech that really set the tone for Dr. King's life. And I'm gonna share a little bit of that speech, starting from the beginning. 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon of light, of hope, to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to the end of a long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vault of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. And so this speech really set the tone for the rest of Dr. King's life. He was leading the Poor People's Campaign to increase economic justice, and he also realized that the hearts and minds of people were slower to change than dollars and investments. People will take your money without giving you respect, and they will embrace your ideas without giving you credit as long as it enhances their bottom lines. But it is important to understand that in the United States, we had challenges making sure that all people had access to resources. So when the Social Security Act of 1935 was created, agricultural and domestic workers were left out of the Social Security Act. That included African Americans and Hispanic Latino folks in the US. This resulted in a loss of $143 billion to those communities. Through payroll tax, the Social Security Act provided unemployment benefits and financial benefits to retired workers over 65, and these communities were left out of that. The GI Bill in 1944, formerly known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, it effectively excluded Black veterans. It provided funds for college, housing, and unemployment insurance. And the lack of access cost Black Americans another $45 billion. Richard Rothstein outlines this history in his book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. But it is important to also know that in spite of these challenges, Dr. King and his contemporaries, their work was not in vain. They worked with President Lyndon Johnson to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned discrimination based on a person's color, race, national origin, religion, or sex. And they also passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This law helped to enforce the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment is the amendment that gave Black men the right to vote in 1870. But the Voting Rights Act of 1965 ensured that no American citizen would be denied the right to vote based on their skin color. As we continue to go, I think it's important that you understand that the work that Dr. King and his contemporaries did really set the foundation for diversity, equity, and inclusion as we know it today. And so when we look at the origins, we look at the origins of affirmative action, the origins of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's important that we lean into it so that we understand it. Because when we have these conversations, it's often that folks are like, well, I'm not sure what we're talking about. I don't really know what that means. Let's talk about it. I want to make sure that we have some context for the work that we're talking about today and why we are having this discussion about the business case for DEI. And so diversity, equity, and inclusion as we know it really emerged from government leadership. The government began this process first with the military and then in other federal spaces. Affirmative action was ultimately created to combat racial exclusion in the workplace. And it's also important for us to understand what affirmative action is and what it isn't. And so when we think about this work, while it started in federal spaces, it evolved into education and then evolved into the workplace. Some of the earliest DEI work began in World War II. The U.S. military executive order, it was related to the U.S. military and U.S. defense, right? Executive Order 8802 in 1941 was issued by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and it prohibited racial discrimination in the defense industry. This was primarily aimed at opening up wartime jobs to African Americans, and it also helped the country to win World War II. The U.S. military officially began the process of desegregation on July 26 of 1948, when President Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981. This order declared that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. Court rulings like Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 continued this work. This ruling ended racial segregation in public schools. And just a few years later, on March 6 of 1961, President John F. Kennedy issued Executive Order 10925. This included a provision that government contractors take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. The intent of this executive order was to affirm the government's commitment to equal opportunity for all qualified persons and to take positive action to strengthen and to realize the true equal opportunity for all. This is really the first official reference to affirmative action, and this order also established the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity, known today as the EEOC, to oversee compliance with Executive Order 10925. 10925 was later superseded by Executive Order 11246 in 1965 by Lyndon Baines Johnson. This new executive order went into effect September 24th, 1965, and it prohibited employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, and national origin by those organizations that were receiving federal contracts and subcontracts. In 1967, President Johnson amended the order to include sex as a list of attributes that could not be used to prevent someone from being hired. And Executive Order 11246 also requires federal contractors to take affirmative action to make sure that they are promoting the full realization of equal opportunity for women and minorities. And so it's important that we understand the origins of this work, the origins and the designs and the rationale behind the creation of these executive orders, because they were really designed to ensure that all Americans had access to the resources that were provided by the federal government and by their tax dollars. And so the challenge that emerged really at the start of these affirmative action programs were the requirements that there were goals for women and minorities. These goals have long been criticized as hiring quotas, and the critics said that they excluded white men from pools of workers. This has never really been true. These goals were designed to make sure that all people had access, and it's important for us to understand this as we talk about this work. And so as diversity, equity, and inclusion started to emerge and transition from the federal perspective, it moved into higher education. In the 1960s through the 1970s, student enrollment for Black students increased from less than 250,000 students to more than 1 million students. Title IV of the Higher Education Act of 1965, and then the GI Bill later in 1968, and the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1972 also led to increased access for Black students after those executive orders were passed. But diversity, equity, and inclusion really took off in higher education after Dr. King's assassination in 1968. There were many student protests around the country, and San Francisco State University was the first institution to create a Black Studies department and to really create diversity services in higher education. The 90s saw an expansion of diversity services from primarily serving Black students to embracing a broader range of diversity, including students who are women, students who are Latino, GLBT, and many other identities. And so I talked about the pushback from the start and the opposition to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I want to talk a little bit more about it so that we know what's happening and we know what has happened. Once affirmative action became expanded and became a part of the college admissions process, legal challenges emerged. Many colleges and universities created admissions policies and scholarships to attract more diverse student bodies and to create more access to higher education following integration. There was pushback, and some of the pushback took the form of legal cases, and I'll talk about a couple different legal cases and political maneuvers that have been a part of this conversation. One of the earliest ones is Bakke versus the Regents of the University of California in 1978. This is one of the early affirmative action cases, and a white student claimed that he was denied admissions to medical school because of racial quotas. There were some set aside spaces for minority students in the University of California system, and this student felt like they were denied a space in the medical school because of these quotas. The Supreme Court ruled that while racial quotas were unconstitutional, race could still be considered as one factor among many in university admissions. So this is still allowing some aspects of diversity to be a part of the admissions policies. And I think this is important because as far back as 1978, it was clear that affirmative action policies couldn't have quotas, but the argument persisted even beyond then. Affirmative action in the workplace was promoted by the federal government in hiring and contracting. But again, there was growing opposition. In the face of this opposition, there was the Civil Rights Act of 1991 that strengthened workers' protection against discrimination, and it really allowed for damages in cases where there was intentional employment discrimination. That was Congress's way of acting against the opposition, but the opposition continued. In California in 1996, Proposition 209 was passed, and it ended affirmative action in public employment, education, and contracting in the state of California. Similar measures were passed in other states, including Washington, Michigan, and Florida. Less than a decade later, in 2003, the Grutter versus Bollinger Supreme Court case involving the University of Michigan Law School upheld the use of affirmative action in admissions, emphasizing the importance. These court cases continue. In 2013 and 2016, Abigail Fisher versus the University of Texas was filed, and it also involved a challenging of the affirmative action policies at the University of Texas. The Supreme Court upheld the university's use of race as a factor in admissions. But that wasn't the end. In the last few years, more than 20 states have proposed laws that limit DEI efforts in education, and there are threats that these laws could be mirrored on the federal level, and they all follow the same blueprint. They claim that DEI discriminates against white folks and indoctrinates students against the United States. Most recently, many folks have heard about the Students for Fair Admissions case of Harvard and University of North Carolina. Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and the University of North Carolina. The Supreme Court ruled on this case in 2023, and it has impacted diversity, equity, and inclusion significantly, and really led us to today's conversation. In this particular decision, the Supreme Court ruled against affirmative action in the policies at Harvard and UNC. They were ruled to be unconstitutional. This decision marked a significant rollback in the affirmative action process and programs in higher education. Even though the court only ruled on these particular schools and these particular cases, it created what folks say is a chilling environment, And so what this has done is it has pushed lots of organizations, businesses, schools, and other institutions to reconsider their diversity efforts. Even Congress eliminated its DEI office in March of 2024. The work that they were doing went to other offices, and I think it's important that we pay attention to this because it creates a difficult climate to navigate when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. People have not highlighted the benefits, they have only talked about some of the challenges. And some of the opposition includes claims of reverse racism, perceptions that DEI is divisive, political and social backlash, legal and financial risks. Companies are being threatened to be sued. Lots of organizations have received letters and said, hey, you're not in compliance, this is an issue. And so it creates a chilling environment when it relates to DEI. And then in some cases, it also leads to DEI fatigue. People are tired of talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it's important that we recognize some of the challenges and we recognize some of the issues that are related to this pushback against diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so what does this mean? It means that companies have scaled back their efforts. It means that folks have rethought what they were committed to. There were a number of companies just in 2020 that committed billions of dollars to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And here we are in 2025, and those efforts are nowhere to be found by a number of companies. Large companies like McDonald's, Meta, used to be Facebook, they said, we're not going to do this anymore. And so it's important that we understand that all is not lost, right? We've got to lean into the benefits, right? The benefits benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion. While the courts were ruling against North Carolina and Harvard, there were more than 70 Fortune 500 companies that came together and talked about the benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion. They talked about building diversity in education. They talked about the fact that racial diversity enriches the educational experience, right? They talked about DEI helps to redress some of the historical discrimination. Affirmative action helps to mitigate some of the effects of those lost dollars from the Social Security Act and the GI Bill not being appropriately shared with all communities, right? They talked about how you can narrowly tailor policies that considered race about the societal and educational benefits that come with a diverse perspective. And then they also pointed out that there's really no viable race-neutral alternatives. We haven't yet created those pathways, and I think it's important for us to pay attention to this. And they also talked about legal precedents, because the most recent ruling just threw all of those legal precedents out the window. And so it's important that folks know that there is broad support for diversity, equity, and inclusion. What does this mean for companies, right? It means that there is improved financial performance, right? Academic evidence shows that diverse research teams make better decisions 87% of the time. The McKinsey & Company report in 2020 found that companies that have more gender diversity are 35% more likely to have above average financial returns, increased innovation and problem solving, expanded market reach and customer insight. When you think about some of the products that you have here at Henkel, how many of those products have moved into particular communities and thrived in particular communities? That can't happen unless you have diverse scientists and diverse team members working together. It's important that you create and you increase talent retention and talent attraction to your organizations. People want to go to a place where it's more diverse. 47% of Gen Zers are non-white, 52% of Generation Alpha is non-white. Glassdoor found that 67% of job seekers considered workplace diversity as a key factor when evaluating job offers. So it's really important to lean into the benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's important that you pay attention to the enhanced employee engagement and productivity that comes from that, as well as mitigate some of the risks that could come if you're found to be in violation of EEOC. It's also important to pay attention to global trends. The world is becoming more connected and more diverse. And if we exclude large swaths of our communities, or large swaths of our population, we could be left behind as organizations. And it's really, really important that we understand that we have an ethical imperative. We have to believe that this is the right thing to do, and we have to lean into it. And so these companies said American businesses cannot foster a diverse workplace on their own. They depend on universities, they depend on communities to help grow and to help change the face of these organizations. And so this court decision had a chilling effect, and it really led us to where we are today, where we're having these conversations, because so many companies and so many organizations said, hey, we're scared of what might happen to us, so we're going to shut down these programs voluntarily, and they're going to miss out on all those benefits that I just highlighted for you. And so it's important that we understand that we have to double down on our DEI efforts. Companies like Microsoft, Google, Salesforce, Henkel, you all are staying committed to this work because you see the benefits and you believe in it, and it's a corporate value that you stand by. It is important that we continue to lean into this work, and it's important that we come together really under the banner of one of Dr. King's most profound calls to action, the fierce urgency of now. This is our path forward. This is the way that we can make a difference, because it's not just a moral imperative, it is really a profit imperative. And when we think about the bottom lines for our companies, we think about the bottom lines for our stakeholders and our stockholders, we have a duty to do the right thing. And the right thing is to embrace and engage with everybody, because the cost of inaction is that we could fade away as organizations, we could become irrelevant. And so when we think about Dr. King's words when they were spoken decades ago, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of our old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. And it is my hope that we are free from the shackles of prejudice and that we lean into DEI, because I'm optimistic and I know that we are better together. Thank you.
We are now going into our Q&A segment of the program this afternoon. I want to start first with any questions that may have come in online. Do we have any questions? Greg? Any questions? Oh, I thought I saw. Maybe it's on my end. Give me 1 second.
I think there's a mic.
Yes, and also we have questions for in the room. I believe one question that I did see is, how do you balance the need for immediate action with the need for long-term systemic change in D&I efforts?
I think that's an excellent question. And I think the immediate action is to stay the course. Continue to double down and do the work related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Make sure that folks have access to resources, access to jobs, have access to professional development. That is the important thing, I think, to do now. And I think for the long term, we have to continue to model the best practice of engaging with diverse clients, diverse customers, and diverse communities. Because when we lead the way, when we show what it means and we show that we can be successful and profitable by doing those things, other companies will follow, and I think that can make a difference. So I think the short term is to keep going and keep doing the work, and the long term is just to be an example and to set an example for everyone who might be following.
All right, another question I saw is, what are some of the best ways for employees to show support of their company's DEI efforts?
Absolutely. So some of the best ways to show support are exactly what you're doing right now. Showing up for these conversations, being a part of difficult conversations, showing support for diverse folks, and really engaging in some conversation, because I think professionally and personally, we don't have a lot of opportunities to engage with diverse folks. At work and at school are the primary locations where you get to engage with diverse folks. There's a stat that says the most segregated day in America is Sunday, right? So we don't even worship together. So it's really important that we take advantage of these opportunities to come to events like these. You support them, you ask questions, you be engaged. You can go to ERGs even if you don't share that particular identity. You can go to learn. You can go and be a part of it. You can stay committed to work to supporting initiatives outside of the workplace and challenging yourself to get out of your comfort zone a little bit. So I think those are some of the ways that you can support this kind of work and to support ERGs.
All right, I think one last one. What role do individuals, especially those in leadership positions, play in accelerating DEI initiatives in the face of ongoing inequality? Absolutely.
So leadership is really the starting point for diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. People think that it is a ground up piece, but these programs can't be successful unless you have a sponsor at the C-suite level or above, and just the CEO, whoever it could be. Someone has to sponsor and support these efforts, and they have to model what it looks like to be a part of an inclusive and an engaging organization. It helps, obviously, to bubble up from the ground up, but it won't last unless your leadership is committed to this work, your leadership supports this work, and it's more than just lip service. Because we saw what happened in 2020 after George Floyd died. We saw all kinds of lip service, billions of dollars in commitment, and then we look now, we don't see any of that. So it's more than lip service. Show up to events, be engaged in events, provide resources for these events, and really just stand on business when someone asks you, where you are in terms of your diversity, equity, and inclusion goals.
Very well. Do we have any questions in the room? Oh, we have two. Let's see, Martina over here, and I'll be right on this side. We have a. So I was afraid. I'll throw it from here all the way over there.
Great throw, Angeline. I'm Martina. I'm from Research and Development. So this is a really trying time, and there's a lot of like negativity going on right now, and I think people are exhausted from all the messages, and then hearing about companies abandoning DEI efforts and things like that. I mean, what can we do to support, I guess, each other, but what can the company do to support employees through this? Because it's stressful, it's also very distracting, right? And I feel like it's taking away from the potential for positive. So what can we do to support each other?
Excellent question. I think the number one thing is to get to know one another, right? We come from different backgrounds and different perspectives, but we don't always know each other, right? And so when we get to know one another, we get to understand how people want to be supported, right? I think we have to embrace the platinum rule, right? The golden rule is treat everybody how you want to be treated, but the platinum rule is treat everybody how they want to be treated. And it's really, really important for us to get to know each other so we can know how to support each other. What is the best way, right? For some people, it's, hey, let's have a conversation about it. For other people, I need a hug. Other people, I need to go out to lunch. Other people, I just need you to show up and just be near me, right? Whatever it is, you find out what it takes to support each other. And I think the other piece, too, is educating yourself on the issues. When you look at some of the opposition to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that opposition is grounded in assumptions and fear tactics and things like that, but it's not grounded in the data. The data tells us that we are all benefiting, right? Some of the data that I looked at is the GDP of the US has grown by leaps and bounds since we integrated corporations and we integrated work, right? We are all benefiting. This is the rising tide that lifts all ships, right? And so if we pay attention to the data, we pay attention to the real and regular impact, then it helps us all to thrive and better understand, and I think to be less stressed about it. This is why I'm the DEI optimist, because I look at the data, I look at our history, and I see that we have come a long way, baby. We really have. And we still got a long way to go, but it comes from recognizing that we've benefited and will continue to benefit as long as we stay connected, stay engaged, and get to know one another.
I kind of want to, I know there's another question in the room and there's probably another one in the back, but I'm sorry. I just kind of want to piggyback off of what Martinez shared as well too, because I think some of the fatigue comes from perception of our actual reality. Because now everything has been magnified around these programs, even with people being fired. For instance, like the most recent, I want to say, news article title that you see almost every day. So I guess I do want to continue to figure out how do we handle with the perception of this reality, especially given that it's contrary to the data.
Yeah. So I think individual stories sometimes get amplified, and people think the exception is the rule, but I think we know and we look at the data, and the data shows that those exceptions are not nearly as prominent as folks would lead you to believe. We look at some of the headlines. The headlines will highlight outrageous, once-in-a-lifetime type stories and say, hey, this could be you, so support me or do this differently or whatever it may be. People often look at the exception and try to make it the rule. And I think if we pay attention to what is happening on a grand scale, a macro scale, as opposed to a micro scale, I think we can do better and we can feel better about our own realities.
Thank you so much. I know that there is another question over here in the room.
First, I just want to say thank you for being here and teaching us all about this. I guess my question would be, what do you think is the biggest hurdle or barrier in the face of DE&I right now?
I would say fear. I think people are afraid to embrace the work and to appreciate the benefits of the work. The fear is that I'm going to be the next target, my organization is going to be the next target if we embrace this work, right? But I think the opposite is happening. Costco shut down a proposal to get rid of DEI at their organization, right? Apple just did the same thing. And those folks are getting nothing but support. People are appreciating that, right? And so I think fear of being ostracized, fear of your company failing, fear of making a mistake. But the reality is we just got to give each other some grace because we're going to make mistakes, right? None of us are perfect. But if we are leaning into the work with the intention of bending that arc of the moral universe towards justice, then I think we can really make a difference. And I think we can get over that fear.
Do we have any additional questions in the room that I didn't miss? I thought I saw some hands. Yes. I can't throw that far.
I think I can.
Okay, good. Yes.
Hi, my name is Julie. I'm very loud naturally, so I'm not going to hold this too close to my face. Hi, my name is Julie. Thank you so much for coming here today. I think one thing I've been involved with different efforts in terms of recruitment throughout the years, going to college fairs and things like that. And I think one way that I'm curious is, for lack of a better way to say this, I'll go to, a college fair and it's me and a coworker. And that coworker is whoever's available, at the time. And odds are, honestly, in the office I'm based of, it tends to be, another cisgender white person. And it's funny, a lot of the people that we see that come to our table, I feel like align and look like us and think like us and have similar backgrounds. And I'm just wondering if you would have advice of how we can outwardly communicate, hey, we're not just, we're not all the same over here, regardless of saying, hey, I have a cousin or I have a friend or whatever. Is there a way we can communicate or show or demonstrate as Hinkle outwardly and openly, even in our day-to-day lives or in our corporate life, like, hey, we're open. We're not just, we're not just what you see here today. We're open to different pathways of thinking. I know it's kind of a weird, vague question. You can go with it wherever you want.
No, it's a great question. I think you're identifying one of the challenges of recruiting diverse folks. Those are some of the challenges. I think it's important when you're trying to recruit a broad group of folks, you need to highlight who's here, right? Hinkle Black Alliance is a part of Hinkle, right? Is there a video? Is there a brochure? Is there something that you're showing that helps people understand that Hinkle is not just what you see here, but Hinkle is this too, right? I think, it's not helpful to try to be what you're not, but you are all these things, right? You have these organizations, you've got a track record, you've got products, you've got a placement in the community. You have all these things, so you've got to try to highlight all those things, even in those short conversations. And that's why if you can't have someone who represents an organization or a department, you often have materials, right, that represent those departments, right? So just make sure that you're representing organizations like Hinkle Black Alliance, you're representing any other organizations that, are not a part of the identities of the folks who are present. And I think it's not faking the funk or anything. You're just highlighting everything that you are because you're not just one thing.
All right. And I think that is it. And we are coming up close to our time. So thank you so much, Dr. Abdullah. Again, everyone, please give him a round of applause for this important conversation. And in closing, I just want to say quickly that thank you for everyone who joined us online, everyone who is here in the room with us. I really, really want to, again, thank Dr. Abdullah for such a compelling business case for DEI. It highlighted the federal policies that started DEI, the opposition against DEI, benefits of DEI, and a way forward. As we navigate the evolving conversation around and about DEI, it is important to keep the spirit of together we win. So thank you so much, our audience. We look forward to having more additional programs throughout the year. HBA and all the other employee resource groups here continue to put on great events for us so that we continue to learn, grow, and engage as a corporation. So thank you once again, and I hope that you guys have a great rest of your afternoon. Oh, please enjoy our refreshments. We have plenty of drinks, chips, cookies.
Listen, I was like, I don't know.
Please do not leave without enjoying some of the refreshments that we have here. Absolutely. I'm gonna have a few people. Mia.